Perfect. So I'm really, really excited for our next session. And we have Dr. Seixas here, and I will briefly talk about his bio, and then we'll go straight into the questions. But first, how are you doing, Dr. Seixas?
I'm well. Thank you so much, Dr. Olaya. Pleasure seeing you, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So, Dr. Seixas is associate professor at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He's also the founding director of the Media and Innovation Lab and associate director of the Center for Translational Sleep and Cardiac Sciences. His work has been supported and funded by the NIH and the NSF, and he's in charge of a lot of different industry and foundation organizations. He's also been recognized as one of the top 100 inspiring Black scientists by Cell Press and has over 175 high impact peer reviewed publications, book chapters, articles, and presentations. He's also featured a lot on TV and other media outlets through CNN, CBS, NBC, and Associated Press. And we're so excited to have him here for our first SciCon conference.
I am excited. Thank you so much. Wow, the panel that you've had over the last few weeks, and particularly today, have been just tremendous. So I'm just really happy to be part of this. Thanks.
Absolutely. So we'll first start off with a few definitions to make sure that everyone really tries to understand exactly what we are going to be discussing today. And what we are discussing today is how do we have rigorous science through inclusivity, through decentralized trials. And so decentralized trials are defined, this was through also Cell Press, as studies executed through telemedicine and mobile and local healthcare providers, utilizing processes and technologies differing from traditional clinical trial models. And remote decentralized trials are defined as an operational strategy for technology-enhanced clinical trials that are most accessible to participants and patients by moving clinical trials activities to more local and home-based settings. So Dr. Seixas, you're one of the first principal investigators to launch decentralized trials with extramural funding through the NIH, utilizing a health equity lens, which right now we know is a big, problem and issue in clinical trials in general on how do we make them more equitable. Can you please share more about this and also with your work of doing this with COVID-19?
Sure. Thank you so much. So, to be quite honest, we've been practicing, decentralized trials before it became a thing, to be quite honest. But I'm happy that it has been codified and formalized, because I think with that framework, it will allow many others to really join in the cadre of folks doing this type of work. And essentially, the reason why we pursue this line of work, it really became an outgrowth of concerns expressed to us by patients, and what we have also observed. And what we wanted to do is that we wanted to tackle some of our more, kind of vexing issues that plague our inability to conduct successful research. First, access. We knew that we wanted to increase access to all, not just a select few of individuals who had the time and the resources to participate in trials. We also wanted to address the issue of privacy. Many people believe that if you are capturing their data, they don't know where it lives. And so we wanted to be able to ensure that there is transparency as to how their data are collected and where it's stored. But we also recognize that if we want to be able to reach many people across different sectors and different communities, across different socioeconomic status, we really needed to ensure that we needed to make our process more efficient. It needed to be more dynamic and comprehensive. And this would allow us to not just capture traditional markers and predictors and risk factors for disease, but also digital biomarkers, because that would allow us to fully capture what might be driving or engendering disease, poor health, and allow us to be able to better capture data in a very dynamic, real-time way to understand how we can actually make certain adjustments to improve overall health. And so in many ways, here's what we did in terms of our process. So typically what we do, almost as if we did this in a reverse engineer way. We wanted to ensure that first, We communicated with our community steering committee, or what others may call an advisory board. And this really consists of individuals from the community, because this will allow us to establish pain and opportunity points. Because if you don't have buy-in from the community, they don't want to be part of these studies. And these are the folks who serve as credible messengers in the community, to have them be interested in the type of work and to be interested in their own health, because essentially we want to make people know that these studies are really here to help them. And this allowed us to do human-centered testing of devices, allowed us to develop architectures that would balance privacy as well as being user-friendly. And then from there, we did several different tasks where, before we roll out any kind of decentralized trial in our community, we ensure that we do a readiness needs assessment, a cost analysis, a technical infrastructure assessment, as well as looking at the level of adaptation and flexibility of our trial into other different settings. Because one of the things that many people are concerned about is the process systematized in a way that it can lead to reproducibility and replicability. And so if we are able to ensure that we look at, or we develop infrastructures or processes that allow us to be able to adapt and to be flexible across different contexts, that will allow us to ensure that we have a successful decentralized trial.
Absolutely. And one of the main factors of success in a decentralized trial is that we are able to get the proper results. And we're also able to get it in a way where we're getting the information from every single portion and participant from the trial. And so we're really excited that, the conference theme is the intersection between decentralized science and meta science. So can you share like your thoughts briefly on how can we increase the quality of scientific research through decentralized trials?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I mean, all your questions are great. I think here's how we have done this, and we've thought through this very deeply, but we're continuing to think through it. So what we have done is that when you look at the pillars of science, we try to look at what does a traditional method do and what does a decentralized trial do? Because in many ways, that's how we understand the meta science, to think about the science of science or the research of research. And so what we've done is that we have highlighted about 7 different components or pillars of science. First is the researcher and the scientist. What is their role? I would suggest that the role of the researcher and the scientist in a traditional approach is that in many ways, researchers take on this deity where they superimpose their ideas in terms of how they develop research questions and hypothesis building and testing. What we've done instead, we have decentered that through a decentralized trial framework, where instead the researcher and scientist is someone who co-creates, and they tell the lived experience of the participant in a very phenomenological way. The second major component of the science of science is what's the role of the participant? In traditional approaches, they see the participant as a subject. And that has a lot of political and existential types of impact, subjecting them to something, not in many ways tapping into the agency of the participant. Instead, we have decentralized it in a way where we treat them as volunteers. And so with that, the third component, their data, it's not seen as a black box where it's owned by the researcher, which is how it's traditionally done, but instead we have what we call more transparency, and the data are owned by the participant. Then the fourth component has to do with what is the value proposition? What's the value proposition of the research or the science? It's important for us to share this because oftentimes in a traditional approach, it's oftentimes what we say prescribed discovery of mechanisms, meaning we want to ensure that whatever we're studying will have a significant impact on a certain outcome. But oftentimes when you have null findings, when you don't find what you're looking for, does it mean that that was a futile exercise? No, instead, through a decentralized approach, that we see the value proposition as being exploratory. And that's how we're able to bring other participants, particularly historically, people who are historically not represented in research. And then the other component of science is what we call the business model. what is the business of science? What's the business of research? And traditionally, we see it as very corporate, especially in academic medicine, and it's a very centralized revenue where you have to receive extramural funding. That money primarily goes to the institution, primarily goes to the researcher, but instead what we've been able to do in a decentralized way is to create cooperatives, and we're not the only ones doing this, others have done this, where it is a cooperative, it's a co-ownership of the revenue and the business model. And so the last two components have to do with what's the apparatus of the science? How is it that you conduct the research? What tools do you use? And typically in traditional research, they usually use what we call a researcher-focused approach. You're only going to use the tools that are most rigorous and precise and accurate. And I'm not saying that's not important, but what we know is that oftentimes those procedures are very cumbersome and not patient-centered. And what we do instead when we build these decentralized trials is that they're more volunteer-focused, because it's important for us to strike a really nice balance between whether or not if our participants will not get so overwhelmed by the technical aspects of our decentralized trials and the tools in that. And last but not least, the approach. What type of approach are we using? And in traditional approaches, we use what we call the patient coming to us, right? And that's how traditional medicine is practiced, right? People come to physicians and providers to seek care, but instead we have flipped that, where we are going to the patient, where research is done on the terms of the participant, where we can find this common ground. And so there are certain things that in exercising this, we have to be aware of what are some potential barriers. One is, what's the regulatory system, the compliance system? This has been very difficult for us to roll out in a traditional academic medicine because, ethical review boards aren't necessarily wired, because in many ways they are governed by certain HIPAA laws, and that's important, but it's driven primarily based on the legal ramifications of pursuing science. Then also you have to be careful about the technological maturity of the communities that you're going to engage in. So what we do is that even if we're rolling out a digital decentralized trial, instead what we do is that we have a very robust educational process informing and increasing people how to use digital technologies. And then we want to ensure that the patient experience is accessible, feasible, and does not make them leave the experience as if they're just so overwhelmed or they're not intelligent. And so that's how we've been able to do this.
That is so exciting, especially how you broke down the various different components on how to actually build a decentralized trial. So just to kind of get a more of a helicopter view for the big question, which is also the title of this talk, is how do we make research more rigorous and inclusive through decentralized trials? So if you have like an advice for other principal investigators who might be wanting to do this, like based on your own experience, how do we first, make it rigorous, and how do we make it inclusive?
No, I think these are some tough and great questions.
Yeah.
so thank you. So I think for us, we look at rigor in two ways, and it's not different from how people traditionally look at rigor. Typically, people look at rigor as some form of systematic approach. And what I would, concede is that that's important, but I would suggest that it is quite narrow. Because when people talk about rigor, they think about setting up a system, procedures of recruitment and collecting data and processing data, collating data, analyzing data, and writing about the results, because they want to be able to increase the reproducibility and the replicability of it. Because of the type of work that I do, we know that replicability is not the holy grail, because everything differs based on context. And so for us, we believe that in order to be systematic, that we must also consider that the systematization needs to be inclusive. What do we mean by that? It means, therefore, are you reaching a wide cross-section of people, and are you doing that systematically in a way that would lead to authentic participation of all people of all walks of life to want to be part of a research study? And so because of, we recognize that those are two key areas in which we must understand the idea of rigor and being systematic, ensuring replicability and reproducibility, but also inclusive, because that takes into consideration context and how that impacts results and the whole research process. And we've created the precision and personalized population health framework. And we have reverse engineered the entire research process, ensuring that we utilize the JEDI framework: justice, equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And so what we do when we lay out the entire research process in terms of community engagement and recruitment and engagement and the whole study process and the dissemination of results and impact on policy, we are able to ensure that we can do rigorous science, inclusive, but ensure that the implementation and the delivery of these trials are such that is empowering, because sitting at the center of it is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so those are some areas that, we would really encourage people to take into consideration. Our paper, really describes this on, precision and personalized population health framework as well. Sorry, I don't have enough time to describe it in detail.
No worries. So we encourage everyone to check out that paper, as well as a really, great article. And what is really interesting, I think, is that a lot of people who are now currently building in this space is that some people are currently building for our current foundation of what's happening right now, but people are also thinking about how can we utilize these concepts to help, for a brighter future. So just for one last question is, personally, Dr. Seixas, what are your hopes and futures, and what is your hope for the future of decentralized trials based on what you're currently doing? And what is something that we can be doing better at to prepare for the future?
Well, I think having more conversations like this, and I applaud ResearchHub for doing this, and your colleagues as well for bringing and convening a very diverse group of individuals thinking through this, because the more we can create an ecosystem to do this, the better. The more our tools, the more our processes will be more refined and will be more suited for all. I think fundamentally what I foresee and I hope is that we must also decentralize trials. And here's why it's important. And the reason why I think it's important is because we must also recognize that there is hegemony really sitting at the center of a decentralized trial as well. And some of you might say, whoa, I thought we were the ones who were, kind of deconstructing the hegemony in traditional research. But here, let me explain why this is important. And it's not a bad thing, because any framework has assumptions. So, traditional research trial has its assumptions, and decentralized trials has its own assumptions as well. So here they are. There's an assumption that there is high device tech literacy. We have found that not to be true. And even in instances where we enter into certain spaces where we assume that these communities do not have a phone or a mobile phone or don't, that we actually have had to suspend those. So be careful that you want to ensure that you suspend some of your assumptions, while at the same time balancing that we can't be shoving things on people's throats. So that's one assumption that we must be aware of, especially in decentralized trials. And the other assumption is that we believe that people ought to care about our digital technologies and trials because it's cool. That there are some people for whom, like Miss Jones or Mr. Hernandez, who has type 2 diabetes, who's working 2 jobs, or who is a day laborer, that the cool factor is not sufficient for them to participate in a clinical trial. And so we have to be mindful of that. And also what we need to be aware of is that we don't necessarily need to read into this idea of addressing technical barriers. we want to acknowledge technical barriers, but at the same time, we must also find ways in which we can improve it. Because what's happening, unfortunately, is that we might be exacerbating what we all know about this digital divide. And so for me, in terms of a wish list, my hope is that academic medical institutions establish better partnerships with companies, tech companies, founders, startups, to lead in this space, because I truly believe that decentralized trials should not just be monopolized by pharmaceutical companies, because of the fact that they have found that more traditional approaches of trials have not worked in increasing the diversity in their subject pool, but instead see it as an opportunity to really bring people into the planning process of creating research projects. I also wish that there is more of a regulatory body where we can look at not just traditional research, but also decentralized trials, even if it's on federated approaches or on the blockchain of some sort, that we need some kind of regulatory body to ensure that the decentralized folks don't become the new center, right? Which will really be promoting and promulgate, health disparities. I think we need an honest broker. So any study that you are creating, ensure that you have an honest broker, either a steering committee, advisory board, or whomever, and they have to be representative, or somewhat of a czar, so to speak. And we have prided ourselves at the Media and Innovation Lab to serve as such, that when companies come to us, that we said, is your solution population health relevant and ready? And so that's what my wish list is. I'm sure I would love to hear others as well. I'd love to hear yours, Dr. Olaya.
Absolutely. And so I will save my answer on what my wish list is, because I know that many people in the audience have questions. And
Sure.
in a decentralized approach, I don't want to do the one asking other questions. So I'll take an audience question. So we do have one question from Patrick Joyce. He really enjoyed your talk. And he said that he saw a few groups recently involving patients in the actual study design and the methodology of decentralized research studies. So his question is, do you think it is important or valuable from a scientific perspective to empower patients to have a more active role in designing the decentralized clinical trial that they eventually participate in?
I agree. And I kind of said this a bit flippantly in the beginning. I think we've been doing this work before it became a thing. And that's what we would do. We have a steering committee. So here's what we do. So before we submit any grant, that we have community buy-in. Seriously, in terms of the hypothesis design, the focus, what the procedures are. I mean, we have had situations where we have had to change the surveys that we used in our grant because our steering committee said to us, it's too long. We understand it's seemingly more rigorous, but no one is going to do that. And it has forced us. And so in one instance, we were able to cut our survey, the time it would take for a participant to fill out our surveys from about 60 minutes to about 35 minutes. That's meaningful, because if someone is moving from one place to the next, or they have to, in between jobs, and you're getting them on the phone, you're like, I need you to answer these questions. And that's tough. That's a hard sell for them. And I truly believe that, oftentimes researchers believe that if they invite people as part of the research process, especially in drafting what the focus needs to be, that they're going to lose control. And that is so far from the truth. Why? Because many of us who do digital technologies, who use human-centered design, methods of developing apps or digital solutions, know that it is the most enriching and informative element of the development process. And research is no different from that. And so I would encourage everyone to get a steering committee, a group of individuals who are credible messengers in the community, different walks of life. We have, pastors and, faith-based barbershop, beauty salons and all. So that's what I would encourage them to do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Seixas, for this wonderful talk. For more information on Dr. Seixas, please head to the Research Hub website where you can get all of his information. You can follow him on social media and also on Google Scholar to see exactly a lot of the, work that is coming out of his lab. But thank you again for, joining us this Saturday and talking to us about decentralized clinical trials. I mean, it's so exciting.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.